The cathedral bells had scarcely ceased their solemn toll when Lady Julia Beaumont stepped into the cold brilliance of the afternoon, her veil trembling like a captured sigh. Beneath the lace, her face remained composed, yet every heartbeat struck with the quiet violence of expectation unfulfilled. The guests of London's most exacting society watched her glide forward, a portrait of perfect grace, unaware that beneath her ivory composure, something delicate had already begun to fracture. Lord Edmund Harrington stood at the altar like a man carved from duty rather than desire. His gaze, steady to the point of cruelty, met hers only in the formal moments required by ritual. When he spoke his vows, his voice carried the polished restraint of a nobleman fulfilling an obligation, not the warmth of a husband claiming a bride. Still, Julia had believed in the promise of appearances, as all women of her station were trained to do. The moment the ceremony concluded, a strange silence lingered, heavier than applause. It was not celebration that filled the hall, but observation, as though every guest waited for a truth that had not yet revealed itself. Julia felt it first in the tightening of glances, then in the subtle shift of whispered fans behind gloved hands. Something was already wrong. At the Grand Harrington estate, chandeliers spilled fractured light across polished marble floors, and music swelled like an attempt to disguise unease. Julia moved through the ballroom with practiced elegance, yet she felt strangely displaced, as though she were walking through someone else's memory. Edmund, ever composed, drifted at the edges of conversation, answering politely but never fully present. It was there, amid the hum of violins and the rustle of silk gowns, that Julia first noticed her. A woman dressed in mourning black stood near the glass doors leading to the gardens, untouched by the laughter of society. Her presence was not announced, yet it disturbed the air around her, like a note held too long in a delicate melody. Edmund saw her too. Julia did not witness the exact moment their eyes met, but she felt the change in him as clearly as a drop in temperature. His posture shifted, ever so slightly, as though the world had narrowed to a single point beyond the ballroom walls. For the first time since their vows, something unguarded flickered across his composed features. She moved closer through the crowd, drawn by a quiet unease she could not name. As she passed a cluster of guests, she caught fragments of conversation, carefully disguised as idle gossip. "They say he knew her in Paris," one voice murmured. "A scandal they buried before the engagement," another replied. Julia's fingers tightened around her fan, though her expression remained serene. In her world, composure was survival. When she finally reached a vantage point near the staircase, she saw Edmund step away from the gathering. He did not excuse himself. He simply left, as if pulled by an invisible thread only he could feel. The woman in black followed without hesitation, her movements unhurried, certain. Julia's breath caught, but she did not call out. Something deeper than shock held her still, a reluctant understanding forming in the quiet of her mind. She was not witnessing an intrusion, but a continuation of something she had never been told existed. Later, in the half-lit corridor near the study, she overheard it. Edmund's voice, lowered yet unmistakable, carried through the thin barrier of an ajar door. "I will always love you," he said. The words did not belong to her. A pause followed, heavy with years unspoken. Then a woman's reply, soft as grief. "You should not have come to this marriage." Julia stepped back before she could be seen, her pulse steady only by force of will. In that instant, the architecture of her future rearranged itself without permission. She understood, with a clarity that felt almost merciless, that love could exist beyond the boundaries of marriage vows. When she returned to the ballroom, nothing appeared changed. Guests still laughed, glasses still clinked, music still flowed like a carefully rehearsed illusion. Yet Julia now moved through it differently, as though she had crossed into a version of herself that could no longer pretend. Across the room, Edmund returned alone. His expression was unreadable, yet the absence of the woman in black spoke louder than any confession. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met Julia's, and something unspoken passed between them, fragile and incomplete. Then, as the night deepened and the estate doors opened to a sudden rain, Julia saw him leave again. This time she did not merely notice. She followed with her gaze as he descended the steps into the darkness, where the waiting silhouette of the woman in black stood beneath the storm, as if she had always belonged there more than she ever had. Julia remained at the window long after the storm had swallowed them, her reflection wavering against the glass like a second, unspoken self. Behind her, the ballroom continued its fragile performance of joy, yet every sound now felt distant, as though belonging to another life she no longer inhabited. A servant approached once, hesitated, then retreated at the sight of her stillness. For the first time since her arrival into this household, no one guided her, no one corrected her expression, and no one explained what she was meant to feel. She understood then that silence could be a form of exile as much as punishment. Somewhere beyond the rain, Edmund's figure disappeared into the night with the woman who had not been invited, and Julia realized that her marriage had not begun in love, but in absence already shaped long before her name was spoken at the altar. And in that absence, a new truth began to form, quiet and irreversible, waiting for the moment she would finally name it aloud to herself alone. Outside, the rain continued to fall like judgment upon her silence itself. It was the morning after the storm, and Harrington House awakened beneath a sky still heavy with unspoken thunder. Lady Julia Beaumont stood at the tall windows of the West Gallery, watching rain slide down the glass like tears that refused to fall. Within the estate, servants moved with careful silence, as if even the walls had learned to mourn what could not yet be spoken aloud. Edmund Harrington had left before dawn, leaving only the faint impression of absence in rooms that still carried his presence. Whispers had already begun to spread through London society, feeding upon the strange events of the wedding night like vultures upon a wounded field. At breakfast, Julia maintained her composure with the precision of a trained actress, though every bite of bread tasted of ash. The household spoke carefully around her, yet she felt every silence sharpen whenever Edmund's name was mentioned in passing conversation. It was during the second evening dinner that the first fracture in her controlled world became impossible to ignore. The chandeliers burned low over polished silver, and guests laughed too loudly, as if sound alone could prevent truth from entering the room. Julia noticed it first in Edmund's absence at the head table, a space carefully filled by conversation but not by meaning. Then she saw the woman again, this time not in shadow, but standing just beyond the French doors as though invited by memory itself. A hush moved through nearby guests, subtle yet undeniable, as several faces turned toward the figure dressed in mourning black. Edmund's posture changed at once, the rigid discipline of his nobility loosening in a way that no one else seemed to recognize. Julia followed his gaze, and in that instant she understood that she had been standing beside a history she was never told. The woman stepped forward with the quiet certainty of someone who had already claimed a place in another life entirely. She did not bow, nor did she hesitate, but instead lifted her chin toward Edmund as if no marriage ceremony had ever occurred. Julia felt something within her tighten, not with jealousy alone, but with the slow recognition of exclusion from a truth that predated her arrival. That evening, letters were delivered to the estate, sealed in wax darker than wine and marked with unfamiliar initials. Julia found one left upon the writing desk in Edmund's study, placed deliberately where curiosity could not be mistaken for accident. The paper trembled slightly as she unfolded it, revealing words that spoke not of affection, but of endurance and forbidden memory. "If I am ever forced to belong elsewhere, remember that my heart has never left you," it read in careful French script. At the bottom of the page, a name she did not recognize but understood instinctively lingered like a bruise upon meaning. When Edmund returned that night, his coat damp with mist and his expression unreadable, Julia knew nothing would ever remain simple again. He paused at the doorway, sensing the shift in her silence, while somewhere beyond the estate gates a carriage waited in darkness. Julia did not speak when Edmund finally closed the door behind him, yet the sound echoed through her like a verdict she had not requested. The household, sensing the invisible fracture between husband and wife, resumed its duties with exaggerated care, as though silence could repair what words had already broken. Servants avoided Julia's gaze in the corridors, their respect now tinged with uncertainty, as if her position itself had become unstable overnight. In the library, Edmund stood before the fire too long, staring into flames that reflected nothing of his thoughts. He held himself with practiced restraint, yet the absence of the woman in black seemed to echo louder than any confession. Julia watched him from the doorway without announcing herself, learning in that still moment that marriage could feel like watching a stranger think. That night, during a dinner meant to restore normality, conversation flowed like polished glass over hidden cracks beneath the table. Lady Harrington, an elderly relative, remarked upon the importance of lineage, unaware that her words struck deeper than she intended. Julia smiled politely, the expression perfect in form yet hollow in feeling, as though she had borrowed it from another version of herself. At the end of the meal, a knock at the grand doors interrupted the fragile rhythm of civility that had been maintained all evening. A footman entered, pale and uncertain, holding a sealed envelope marked with the insignia of Paris rather than London. Edmund's hand tightened around his glass, a reaction so subtle that only Julia noticed its violence beneath control. The guests continued speaking, unaware that the arrival of foreign correspondents had shifted the entire architecture of the evening. Julia reached for the letter before Edmund could claim it, a decision that surprised even her own measured restraint. Breaking the seal, she felt the wax crumble like the illusion of certainty she had tried to preserve since her wedding day. The handwriting was elegant, unfamiliar, and painfully intimate, as though it belonged to a memory she had never been allowed to inherit. It spoke of waiting, of promises made in shadowed corridors of Paris, and of a love that had survived despite distance and silence. Julia's breath steadied only because she refused to let it betray her, even as the world she knew shifted beneath her feet. When she looked up, Edmund was already watching her, not with apology, but with the burden of truths still unspoken. Beyond the dining room window, the night pressed close against the glass, and somewhere in the distance a carriage door opened slowly. Julia stood motionless as the sound reached her, a second carriage arriving beyond the estate gates, its wheels cutting through wet gravel, and though no one spoke her name, she understood with sudden certainty that the woman from Paris had finally come to claim what silence had preserved until now this very night. Julia did not sleep that night, for the house itself seemed to breathe with unfamiliar tension, as though the walls had learned to listen. The carriage had arrived and departed without ceremony, leaving only the faint imprint of wheels upon wet gravel, yet its presence lingered in every corridor like a spoken accusation. Edmund had withdrawn into silence, locking himself away in the upper study where candlelight flickered until dawn without interruption. Julia remained in the drawing room long after the household had retired, seated with perfect stillness while her thoughts unraveled with quiet precision. The letter from Paris lay upon the table, its ink now feeling heavier than the paper that carried it, as if words themselves could acquire weight through memory alone. When morning came, it did not bring clarity, only a colder version of uncertainty dressed in pale sunlight. Julia descended the staircase with composed grace, though each step felt like a decision rather than a movement. Servants avoided her gaze more carefully than before, their deference now shaped by unease rather than respect. At breakfast, Edmund finally appeared, his expression controlled yet marked by something worn at the edges, like a portrait left too long in rainlight. He did not speak at first, and neither did she, for silence between them had become its own language, one neither had yet learned to translate. It was only when the distant sound of carriage wheels returned that everything shifted again, sharper than before. The household froze in a subtle collective awareness, as though history itself had entered through the gates. Edmund's hand paused mid-motion above his cup, and Julia saw the faint tightening in his jaw that betrayed recognition rather than surprise. He stood without explanation and walked toward the entrance hall, his steps deliberate but restrained, like a man approaching judgment rather than a guest. Julia followed at a distance, unseen but unwilling to remain behind a wall of ignorance any longer. The grand doors opened before Edmund could reach them, revealing the woman in black standing beneath the gray morning light. Elise Beaumont did not enter as an intruder, nor as a guest seeking permission, but as someone returning to a place she believed had already been written without her. Edmund stopped at the base of the stairs, his composure finally fractured by something too long contained. For a moment, no one spoke, and even the estate seemed to hold its breath in deference to what was about to unfold. Elise ascended the first step slowly, her voice soft yet unyielding when she finally spoke his name. It carried no anger, only the ache of time withheld. "You promised," she said, each word measured as though it had been carried across an ocean of years. Julia remained hidden in the shadows of the corridor, watching the geometry of past and present collide within a single frame of living silence. Edmund's reply, when it came, was quieter than she expected, shaped by restraint rather than denial. "I did not forget," he answered, though the weight of those words did not absolve him of their meaning. Elise smiled faintly, but it was not a smile of joy, it was recognition of loss that had already been endured too many times. Julia felt something shift within her chest, not breaking yet, but loosening its hold upon certainty. The estate, so carefully constructed in elegance and order, suddenly felt like a vessel containing histories that refused to remain buried. Later, in the library where the fire had burned low into uncertain embers, Edmund finally asked Julia to speak with him alone. The request was not a command, but it carried the inevitability of truth finally demanding space. She entered without hesitation, though her presence now felt like crossing into a room that no longer belonged entirely to her. Edmund stood by the window, his reflection fractured against the glass like a divided self. "She should not have come," he said, though the words sounded more like resignation than anger. "Yet she did," Julia replied softly, discovering in her own voice a steadiness she had not known before. He turned toward her then, and for the first time since their marriage she saw not a nobleman shaped by duty, but a man suspended between two irreconcilable truths. "I was younger in Paris," he said, "and less aware of what promises could cost when spoken in moments of certainty." Julia listened without interruption, though every word reshaped the architecture of her understanding. Elise had not been a rumor, nor a passing affection, but a life once fully lived and then forcibly abandoned. Edmund's silence had not been absence alone, but preservation of something he had never fully surrendered. When Julia finally spoke, her voice did not tremble, though something within her had begun to move beyond repair. "And what am I in this story you never told me?" she asked, not as accusation but as necessity. Edmund did not answer immediately, and in that pause, Julia understood more than any confession could provide. Outside, the rain began again, soft against the glass, as if the sky itself hesitated to witness what came next. Downstairs, Elise waited by the grand piano, her presence now fully rooted within the estate as though she had never truly left it. And as Julia descended the staircase once more, she realized with quiet certainty that she was no longer entering a marriage, but a reckoning that had finally chosen its moment to begin. Julia paused on the staircase, aware that every gaze within the house belonged to courtesy but to consequence, and as Elise lifted her eyes toward her, something unspoken passed between them, neither hatred nor mercy but recognition of a future that would allow two women to remain unbroken still. Beyond the threshold, the wind rose through the corridor like a warning unspoken by any living voice, and Julia understood that nothing in Harrington House would remain unchanged once the truth finally chose to speak aloud now. Julia descended the staircase with the quiet certainty of someone walking toward a verdict she could no longer postpone. Every step echoed through Harrington House like a reminder that silence had already chosen sides long before words arrived. In the drawing room below, Elise stood near the piano, her gloved fingers resting lightly upon the polished wood as though she belonged to its history more than Julia ever could. Edmund remained by the window, torn between turning away and facing the collision he had spent years delaying. The air between them felt sharpened, as if even breath could fracture what little restraint remained. Elise was the first to speak, her voice soft but deliberate. She did not look at Julia immediately, instead addressing the space where memory and present overlapped. "I did not come to destroy what you have built," she said, though the irony of her presence made the claim impossible to believe. Julia stopped at the final step, her hand resting on the banister, composed yet no longer willing to retreat into politeness. "Then why come at all?" Julia replied, her tone steady but edged with something newly awakened within her. Edmund finally turned, and in that movement Julia saw the full weight of his divided life. He looked at Elise as one might look at a wound that had never fully healed, and at Julia as one might look at a promise still binding despite its strain. "This should not have happened here," he said quietly, though no one in the room believed the estate itself had invited them. Elise stepped forward, closing the distance that time had refused to resolve. "You wrote to me for years," she said, her voice tightening for the first time. "You asked me to wait beyond reason, beyond dignity, beyond anything a woman should endure alone." The words hung in the air like evidence laid before a silent court. Julia felt each syllable settle into her understanding, reshaping what she thought she had been living. Edmund's composure faltered. "I was bound by obligations I did not choose," he replied, though even he seemed uncertain whether that defense still held meaning. Julia listened not as a wife defending a claim, but as a woman witnessing the architecture of illusion collapse in real time. The fire in the hearth cracked sharply, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Julia moved forward, her presence no longer hesitant. "You speak of obligation as though it excuses absence of truth," she said, her voice rising only slightly, yet carrying through the room with unmistakable clarity. "But what of the truth I was never given the chance to refuse?" Edmund's eyes met hers, and something in him shifted, not toward resolution, but toward recognition of irreversible consequence. Elise lowered her gaze, not in defeat, but in the quiet sorrow of someone who had already survived too many versions of hope. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the distant hills, as if the world beyond the estate acknowledged what the walls could no longer contain. Julia stepped fully into the room now, no longer a participant in someone else's story, but a presence refusing to remain silent within it. "I will not be a shadow in a life divided by memory," she said, each word carefully placed, yet burning with certainty. "If love exists here, it cannot survive by hiding behind what came before." Edmund took a step forward, then stopped, as though even movement required permission from forces larger than himself. "I never meant to bind you to suffering," he said, but the fragility in his voice betrayed the limits of intention against consequence. Elise finally looked at Julia directly, and in that gaze there was no hatred, only recognition of a shared fracture. "He cannot keep both past and present without breaking them both," she said quietly, almost gently. The words struck harder than accusation. Julia understood then that the conflict was not between two women, but between memory and continuation, neither willing to dissolve quietly. A distant bell echoed from the estate gates, followed by hurried footsteps in the corridor outside the room. A servant entered abruptly, pale and breathless, announcing that members of society had arrived uninvited, drawn by rumors too large to contain. The outside world was now pressing against the fragile boundaries of their private collapse. Edmund looked toward the door, then back at the two women who now defined the limits of his choices. Julia stood unmoving, while Elise remained as still as remembrance itself. In that suspended moment, Julia spoke once more, her voice lower but absolute. "Decide," she said simply, though the weight of it reshaped everything in the room. Edmund opened his mouth, but no answer came, only the growing sound of voices outside, rising like judgment approaching through the corridors. And as the doors of Harrington House began to tremble under the pressure of arriving witnesses, Julia understood that the final truth of all their lives would be spoken not in private, but before an audience that had already come to see everything fall apart. The heavy doors groaned as distant voices swelled through the marble halls, each sound sharpening Julia's awareness that private agony was no longer contained within these walls. Edmund stepped back as if the very air had turned against him, while Elise remained still, watching the approaching storm of society with resigned calm. Julia did not move, yet something within her had finally settled into irreversible form, a clarity born not of hope but of surrender to truth. When the first guests appeared at the threshold, their expressions were already shaped by rumor and anticipation, eager to witness the fracture they had been promised. Edmund turned toward Julia once more, and in that fleeting glance she understood that whatever choice he made would define not only them, but the ruin or rebirth of everything that followed after this moment. Now as silence collapsed into inevitable public reckoning at last before them all now. The doors of Harrington House opened fully, and the world that had been kept at bay finally stepped inside. Society entered not as guests, but as witnesses, their silks rustling like anticipation given form, their gazes sharp with the hunger for scandal finally confirmed. Julia stood at the center of the drawing room as if she had been placed there by fate rather than choice, her stillness no longer fragile but deliberate. Edmund remained a few steps behind her, caught between the approaching crowd and the two women who had become the axis of his undoing. Elise did not retreat. Instead, she turned slightly toward the gathering, her expression composed in a way that made the room feel colder. Julia understood in that instant that Elise had long ago learned how to survive being observed, even when observation meant judgment. Edmund's breath tightened as familiar voices began to fill the space, laced with disbelief and delight in equal measure. Whispers moved faster than footsteps. "Is that her? The woman from Paris? He brought them both here." Julia heard every fragment, though she did not react. She had been trained for silence since childhood, but this silence was no longer submission. It was calculation. A senior lady of society stepped forward, her voice sharpened by authority and curiosity. "Lord Harrington," she said, her eyes flicking between Julia and Elise, "it appears your household has become unusually crowded." A faint, brittle laughter followed from somewhere in the room, quickly stifled when no one else joined. Edmund finally moved forward, placing himself between the crowd and the two women as if position alone could restore order. "This is not a spectacle," he said, though the very presence of witnesses had already transformed it into one. But society did not come for order. It came for truth stripped of discretion. Julia stepped forward, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her movement. The room shifted subtly as attention reoriented toward her. "If you have come seeking clarification," she said, her voice calm and unmistakably clear, "then I will not deny you the reality you have already decided to believe." A murmur passed through the crowd, but she did not stop. "I am Lady Julia Beaumont," she continued, "and I entered this marriage under the assumption that love and duty could exist in harmony." Her gaze shifted briefly toward Edmund, not with accusation, but with something more final than anger. "I was mistaken." The room grew quieter, not from respect, but from anticipation of what such honesty might unleash. Elise finally spoke, her tone measured but no longer distant. "I did not come to replace anyone," she said, addressing no one in particular, yet ensuring every ear received her words. "I came because time was stolen from me under promises that were never meant to survive distance or obligation." A few faces in the crowd softened, not in forgiveness but in fascination. Tragedy, when articulated, often becomes more acceptable than silence. Edmund closed his eyes briefly, as though trying to contain a fracture widening beyond control. Then one voice from the crowd, emboldened by proximity to scandal, asked what none had yet dared to name. "And what does Lord Harrington choose between them?" The question hung in the air like a blade finally lifted. All movement in the room ceased. Edmund opened his eyes slowly. Julia turned toward him, not pleading, not waiting, but present in a way that demanded recognition rather than explanation. Elise stood slightly apart, her expression unreadable, as though she had already lived through this moment in another form. For the first time, Edmund appeared not as a man of authority, but as one stripped of every structure that had once defined him. "I did not bring this upon you," he said at last, though the words sounded less like defense and more like exhaustion. Julia replied softly, "No. You only allowed it to remain hidden until it could no longer be." That truth struck deeper than any accusation. Elise stepped forward again, her voice quieter now. "Edmund," she said, and for a moment the room felt as though it belonged only to them, "you cannot stand between past and present forever. One will eventually destroy the other if you refuse to decide." He looked at her then, truly looked, as if seeing not the woman from Paris, but the years that had shaped her absence. Then he turned toward Julia, and something in his expression shifted, not toward resolution, but toward recognition of impossibility. The silence that followed was unbearable in its fullness. Outside, rain began again, tapping against the tall windows like impatient judgment. Edmund took one step forward, then stopped. "I cannot," he said quietly. The words were not refusal of love, nor confession of it. They were admission of limitation. A collective breath passed through the room. Society leaned forward, eager to interpret, to define, to conclude. But Julia had already begun to understand what his inability meant. It was not cruelty. It was collapse. She nodded once, as if acknowledging something long understood but never spoken aloud. "Then there is nothing left to choose," she said. Elise lowered her gaze, not in defeat, but in recognition of a truth older than any of them. Love without resolution could not sustain itself indefinitely in the face of reality. Julia turned toward the assembled guests, her voice now carrying the finality of closure rather than confrontation. "You have seen enough to satisfy your curiosity," she said. "There is no scandal left to consume, only consequences to endure privately." A few members of society shifted uncomfortably, denied the dramatic resolution they had expected. But Julia had already stepped beyond their expectations. She turned back toward Edmund one last time. "I will not remain where I am neither chosen nor abandoned with honesty," she said quietly. "I refuse to exist in the space between certainty and hesitation." Then she removed her gloves with slow precision, placing them on the table beside her as if marking the end of a role she had worn too long. Elise did the same a moment later, though her gesture carried a different weight, less resignation than release. Edmund reached out slightly as if to stop something irreversible, but no words followed the movement. And so nothing was stopped. Julia walked past him first, her steps steady, unhurried, each one carrying her further from the life that had defined her arrival into this house. Elise followed shortly after, not as a shadow, but as someone finally no longer bound by waiting. The guests parted instinctively as they passed, as though even judgment could not withstand the force of their departure. Edmund remained where he stood, surrounded by the consequences of choices he had never fully made, watching the two women disappear in opposite directions through the grand corridor. The rain outside intensified, blurring the world beyond the windows into indistinct movement. Julia stepped out into it without hesitation, allowing the cold to meet her as if it were the first honest touch she had felt in years. Behind her, Elise walked toward a waiting carriage, her silhouette gradually dissolving into distance and mist. Neither woman looked back. Inside Harrington House, Edmund finally moved, but only toward the empty space they had left behind. Society slowly began to disperse, its appetite for scandal replaced by the quieter discomfort of witnessing something unresolved. But Julia had already crossed the threshold of their judgment. As the carriage wheels turned and the estate receded into rain and shadow, she understood that she was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, nor by what had been withheld. Only by what she had finally chosen to leave. And far behind her, in a house still filled with echoes of unfinished love, Edmund stood alone at the window, watching the storm erase every trace of the life that had slipped beyond his reach, realizing too late that some silences are not endings, but the beginning of regret that never stops speaking.